It was 2 in the morning when Amina's world shattered. The sound of the front door slamming behind her still echoed in her ears as she stood outside, barefoot on the cold ground, clutching only her small bag. Juma's family had gathered in the living room just moments before, their voices sharp and accusing. They called her bad luck, whispering that her empty womb was the reason their home felt heavy, that she had failed as a wife because she hadn't given them a child. The words cut her deeper than any blade, each insult stripping away the dignity she had carried with pride. But the cruelest part wasn't their accusations. It was Juma, her husband, the man she had chosen, who sat there silently. Not once did he raise his voice in her defense. Not once did he say she was more than a womb, more than a vessel for children. He let their venom pour over her, and when they demanded she leave, his silence sealed her fate. Amina begged with her eyes, searching for the man she thought she knew, but his face was cold, distant, almost relieved. That was the moment her heart broke. Not when the insults were hurled, not when the door was opened, but when the person she trusted most refused to stand beside her. The night air was heavy, the streets of Dar es Salaam quiet except for the distant sound of the ocean. Alone, humiliated and heartbroken, Amina stepped out into the darkness, her life as she knew it ending at 2 a.m. The rain was falling hard that night, soaking through Amina's thin dress as she walked slowly down the empty street. She carried only a small bag pressed to her chest, and inside it, hidden between a change of clothes, was her wedding veil. That piece of white fabric, once a symbol of joy and hope, was now just a reminder of how quickly dreams can collapse. It was heavy with memories, heavier than the rain on her shoulders. Her sandals slapped against the wet ground, each step feeling like it echoed through the silence of the neighborhood. Behind the curtains, lights were still on in some houses. She could sense eyes watching her, neighbors who had heard the commotion and now whispered about her as she passed. Some pitied her, some judged her, but none opened their doors. The whispers felt like stones thrown at her back, and she kept her head down, not wanting them to see her tears mixing with. The night was long, and every corner of the street seemed unfamiliar, though she had walked it many times before. Without Juma's house to call her own, the whole city suddenly felt strange, like it had turned its back on her too. The rain plastered her hair against her face, her bag growing heavier, but she refused to stop. She told herself she couldn't stop. If she paused, even for a second, the weight of the betrayal would crush her. Her heart replayed the scene from just an hour before, the mocking words, the sharp insults, and Juma's silence. His silence was louder than the storm around her. She thought about how much she had given up for him, how she had believed in their life together. Now she was nothing more than a shadow, a woman cast out in the middle of the night. Still, somewhere deep inside her pain, a tiny voice kept whispering, "This is not the end." She gripped her bag tighter and wiped her wet face with the back of her hand. The veil inside reminded her of promises that had been broken, but also of the love she was still capable of giving, this time to herself. Every step she took in the rain was a step away from humiliation and closer to something new, though she didn't yet know what it was. The streets of Dar es Salaam seemed endless, but Amina kept moving, her body shivering from cold, yet her spirit refusing to break. She whispered to herself in the dark, "They wanted me destroyed, but I will not let them win." The rain kept pouring, but so did her determination. And in that lonely, painful walk, she planted the first seed of her own strength. Amina could still remember the girl she once was, sitting in a quiet classroom with books spread open before. She had big dreams then, dreams of finishing her studies, of one day working in an office with her own desk and her own name on the door. But when Juma came into her life, all those dreams slowly faded into the background. He was charming, ambitious, and he spoke of a future they would build together. Amina believed him. She loved him so deeply that she convinced herself her dreams could wait, that supporting him was more important. When money grew tight and Juma's small business began to collapse, it was Amina who carried the burden. She took off her gold bangles, gifts from her late mother, and sold them quietly, telling herself it was only temporary. She pawned her necklace, the one she wore on their wedding day, and slipped the money into Juma's hands without asking for thanks. She told him, "What's mine is yours," and she meant it with her whole heart. To her, love wasn't about words, it was about sacrifice. She cooked for him when he came home late and tired, encouraged him when creditors knocked on their door, and stood by him when friends laughed at his failing ventures. She believed that with patience and prayer, they would rise together. Every time he stumbled, she lifted him. Every time he doubted himself, she reminded him of his worth. She gave more than she had, thinking love would one day return to her in the same way. And yet, as she walked alone in the rain that night, the memories stung like salt on an open wound. How could the same man who once promised to protect her sit in silence while his family pushed her out like trash? How could the husband whose hands she had held through failure not lift a finger when she needed him most? The betrayal felt sharper because it stood against the backdrop of her loyalty. She had poured herself into him, and in return, he left her empty-handed, empty-hearted. What hurt most was not the loss of her jewelry, or the years she put on hold. It was the loss of her trust. She had believed in him more than she had believed in herself. She had chosen him over her own dreams, her own future. And in one night, at 2 a.m, he showed her just how little that devotion meant to him. As the memories played in her mind, Amina's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to ask the sky why love could turn so cruel. But deep down, another truth began to rise inside her. If she had been strong enough to sacrifice everything for him, then she was strong enough to rebuild for herself. Her devotion had been wasted on Juma, but her strength did not have to be. The night after she was thrown out felt endless, but by morning, Amina knew she couldn't wander the streets forever. She thought of one person who had never judged her, never turned away from her, Zuri, her childhood friend. With tired feet and swollen eyes, she made her way across the city to Zuri's small apartment. When the door opened, Amina broke down at last, collapsing into Zuri's arms, the pain she had been holding in finally spilling out. Zuri pulled her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and listened as Amina poured out everything: the insults, the silence of Juma, the humiliation of being pushed into the night like a stranger. When Amina's voice cracked, Zuri held her hand firmly. "You stood by them, Amina," she said softly but firmly. "Now it's time to stand up for yourself." Those words struck Amina like lightning. At first, she shook her head. "I have nothing, Zuri. No home, no family, no one on my side." Her voice was heavy with despair. But Zuri's eyes were steady, filled with the kind of strength only true friends carry. "You have yourself," she replied. "And that's more than they realize. You're not weak, Amina. They wanted you silent, broken. Don't give them what they want." The words dug deep into Amina's heart. For so long, she had lived only to please others, her husband, his family, their expectations. She had measured her worth by their approval. But what had it given her? Nothing but betrayal. For the first time, she began to wonder what it would mean to live for herself, to demand respect, to claim what she deserved. Zuri brewed tea and placed it in Amina's hands, her voice calm but determined. "Crying will not change them. Begging will not change them. But the law, it can. They used you, and they cannot just throw you away. You have rights, Amina, and it's time you fight for them." The idea startled her. Amina had never seen herself as someone who could fight back. She was quiet, patient, forgiving. But as she sat there in Zuri's warm apartment, her wedding veil still tucked in her bag like a wound she couldn't let go of, a new feeling began to rise. It wasn't anger. It was something steadier, sharper. It was resolve. She remembered the sacrifices she had made, the money she had given, the love she had poured out. None of it was worthless. If Juma could not value her, then the world would. The law would. For the first time since that terrible night, Amina's tears dried. She lifted her head, her voice low but steady. "Then I will fight," she said. And in that moment, with Zuri's hand on hers, a broken woman began to turn into something stronger. Amina would no longer beg for a place in someone else's home. She would claim her own ground, and this time, she would not be silent. A week after finding shelter with Zuri, Amina gathered the courage to take the next step. Zuri had already made a few calls, and one name kept coming up: Mr. Cato, a respected lawyer in Kampala known for fighting for women who had been wronged. The journey to his office felt heavy with fear and doubt, but also with a strange new strength. She carried her small bag again, the same one from that night, though this time it held documents and receipts instead of just her veil. When she entered Mr. Cato's office, the room felt different from the world she had been drowning in. It was quiet, filled with shelves of books and the faint smell of paper and ink. Mr. Cato himself sat behind a wooden desk, his face calm, his eyes sharp but kind. He motioned for her to sit, and for the first time in days, Amina felt she wasn't being judged. She wasn't being measured by what she could or couldn't give. She was simply being seen. Her voice trembled at first as she told her story, how she had given up her studies for Juma, how she had sacrificed her jewelry to keep his business alive, how she was thrown out at 2 a.m. with nothing but insults. As she spoke, her hands shook, but Mr. Cato never interrupted. He leaned forward, listening intently, nodding slowly, as if every word she spoke carried weight. His silence wasn't cruel like Juma's. It was patient, respectful. When she finally finished, her throat dry and her eyes wet, Mr. Cato folded his hands and spoke with quiet firmness. "Amina, what they did to you is not only cruel, it is unlawful. You are Juma's wife. That means you have rights. Rights to the property, rights to the business you helped build, rights to dignity." Amina blinked, almost unable to believe it. Rights? The word felt foreign, like something that belonged to other women, stronger women. But Mr. Cato's voice carried no doubt. "You stood by him in every way. The law will recognize that, even if he refuses to. You are not powerless, Amina. You are not at their mercy anymore." Something shifted inside her at that moment. For the first time since the night she was cast into the rain, she felt the flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, like the first light of dawn after a long, endless night. She looked at Mr. Cato, her voice still soft but steadier now. "So, I can fight back." He gave a faint smile, his eyes steady. "Not only can you, you must. And I will stand with you." Walking out of his office, Amina held her bag differently. It was no longer just a reminder of her shame. It was now the beginning of her fight. For the first time, she felt she had a chance to win back not just what she had lost, but herself. Back at Zuri's apartment, Amina sat on the floor with her bag open in front of her. For days, she and Zuri worked side by side, digging through every corner of her past with Juma to find the pieces that could now become her strength. Mr. Cato had been clear. The court needed proof, not just words. And proof, Amina realized, was something she had more of than she first thought. The first thing she pulled out were bank slips. She remembered each one vividly, because behind every transfer was a sacrifice. There was the receipt for the time she sold her mother's bangles, the one for the necklace she had pawned, and the records of countless small deposits that had gone straight into Juma's account. At the time, she hadn't thought twice. Love, she believed, was about sharing everything. Now, those slips of paper weren't just numbers. They were evidence of the life she had poured into his dream. Then came the messages. Amina scrolled through her old phone, her hands shaking as familiar words flashed across the screen. "Forever," he had written late at night. "You and me, always." Promises typed in haste, sweet at the time, but hollow now. Still, Mr. Cato had said even those words mattered. They showed intent. They showed that Juma had bound her with promises he never honored. Reading them again made her chest ache, but she saved every screenshot carefully, turning heartbreak into ammunition. Zuri helped her list names of people who had witnessed her suffering, neighbors who had seen her thrown out that night, friends who remembered her selling her jewelry to cover Juma's debts, even the shopkeeper down the road, who once saw her crying quietly after an argument. Each name carried a story, and each story added weight to the truth she was preparing to tell. There were moments when Amina broke down, her head in her hands, asking, "Why do I have to prove my pain? Isn't it enough that I lived it?" Zuri would lift her chin gently and remind her, "Because they tried to erase you. This evidence will make sure they can't." Bit by bit, the pile of papers, screenshots, and names grew. What had once been scattered memories of devotion and betrayal was now becoming a shield. Amina began to see it differently. This wasn't just proof for the court, it was proof for herself. Proof that she had given everything, that she wasn't imagining her sacrifices, that her story mattered. One evening, as she tied the stack of documents together neatly, she felt a strange calm settle over her. These weren't just receipts and messages. They were pieces of her truth, undeniable and solid. For the first time, she wasn't just remembering what she lost. She was holding in her hands the power to take something back. The day Amina returned to Juma's home, the sun was high and merciless, the streets alive with children playing and neighbors lingering by their doors. This time, she did not come quietly in the night, broken and alone. She came in broad daylight, walking with her back straight, her small bag in one hand and Mr. Cato beside her. His presence was calm but commanding, the kind of presence that made people pause and whisper. Amina felt the weight of eyes on her again, but today it wasn't shame burning her skin, it was strength. As they approached the house, the air seemed to shift. The same windows that had been so bold the night she was thrown out now flickered with movement. Curtains swayed, faces peeked and quickly disappeared. The relatives who had laughed at her misery, who had branded her bad luck, suddenly had no voices. Their silence was different now, not cruel but afraid. Amina's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the steady drum of justice drawing closer. When the front door opened and Juma stepped out, the color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he had seen a ghost. Gone was the woman he had cast aside in the rain. Before him stood someone he no longer recognized, a woman with fire in her eyes, holding the law in her hand. Mr. Cato greeted him politely but firmly, his words sharp with authority. "Mr. Juma, we are here to serve you notice." He handed over the documents, pages heavy with proof of Amina's sacrifices, evidence of her rights, and the demands she was now making. Juma's hands shook as he took them, his eyes darting nervously to the neighbors who were pretending not to stare. The humiliation he had once forced on her was now circling. Amina said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch. She wanted him to feel it, the weight of the moment, the shift in power. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, each word clear. "You tried to erase me, Juma, but I was never gone. And now, I will not be silent." Juma's relatives huddled inside, whispering behind the curtain. The same people who had cheered when she was dragged out at 2 a.m. now hid in the shadows, powerless to stop what was unfolding. For once, they could not shout her down. For once, their words held no power. The street was alive with quiet gasps, neighbors exchanging glances as they watched the scene. Amina stood taller with every second, no longer the abandoned wife, but a woman reclaiming her dignity in front of the very people who had stripped it from her. When she turned to leave with Mr. Cato, she did not look back at Juma. She didn't need to. The fear on his face was enough. This was no longer the end of her story. It was the beginning of his reckoning. The courtroom was packed the morning Amina's case began. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling across the wooden benches where strangers, neighbors, and even distant relatives had gathered to watch. Amina sat beside Mr. Cato, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart beat fast, but her eyes were steady. This was not the frightened woman who had been thrown out at 2 a.m. This was someone who had come to claim her truth. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Mr. Cato rose first, his voice calm but firm as he began to lay out Amina's story. One by one, he brought forward the receipts, bank slips showing how her money had funded Juma's struggling business. The judge studied them closely, nodding as each piece of paper was passed across the bench. Then came the text messages, promises Juma had written with his own hand. Words like forever and always, words that tied him to the very marriage he now tried to deny. Juma's family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When it was their turn, they tried to twist the story. They painted Amina as barren, unlucky, and unworthy. They claimed she had given nothing, that she was a burden. Their voices rose, desperate and sharp, but every time they spoke, Mr. Cato calmly countered with evidence. Witnesses stood to testify. Neighbors who had seen Amina thrown into the rain, friends who remembered her selling her jewelry, even the shopkeeper who had watched her struggle. The more the truth came out, the quieter Juma's family grew. Then came the moment that silenced the room completely. Mr. Cato presented documents proving that Amina's money had not just supported Juma's business. It had made her a rightful shareholder. On paper, she owned a part of the very company Juma now bragged about as his success. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge raised his eyebrows, pausing to study the papers again. Juma's face turned pale, his lips trembling as he tried to protest. She gave it as a gift, he stammered. But the evidence was clear. Her contributions had been investments, and they tied her directly to the growth of the company. What he had tried to hide was now written in black and white for everyone to see. Amina felt her chest rise with a deep breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For so long, she had believed her sacrifices were invisible, erased by betrayal. But here, in this room filled with witnesses, they were undeniable. Every person present now knew the truth. She was not the unlucky wife they painted her to be. She was the woman who had built the very foundation of Juma's success. When the judge finally called for order, the courtroom was still buzzing. Amina sat quietly, but inside her, something powerful was alive. This was more than a case. It was justice catching up with betrayal. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed once again. Amina sat at the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her wedding veil still tucked inside her bag like a quiet reminder of where this journey had begun. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart raced. The judge's face was unreadable as he shuffled through the files, the silence in the room so heavy that even the ticking clock on the wall felt loud. When the judge finally spoke, every head in the room leaned forward. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of truth. After reviewing the evidence, he began, this court recognizes that Mrs. Amina's contributions were not acts of charity, but investments that directly supported and built Mr. Juma's business. As such, she is entitled to ownership stake and rightful compensation. The words seemed to hang in the air, powerful and undeniable. Amina's eyes filled with tears she tried to hold back. For so long, she had been told she was nothing. And now, in front of everyone, her worth was declared, not just as a wife, but as a woman who had given, built, and deserved respect. The judge went on, each sentence striking like a hammer. Juma was ordered to repay the money Amina had sacrificed for him. He was instructed to give her formal recognition of her ownership in the company. And perhaps most crushing of all for him, he was required to apologize publicly for the humiliation he and his family had caused. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. All eyes turned to Juma, whose face was pale, his lips tight with anger and shame. He glanced at his relatives for support, but they sat frozen, their heads bowed, their voices gone. The same family that had mocked Amina at 2 a.m. now couldn't even meet her eye. Their silence, once a weapon, was now their shame. Slowly, Juma stood, his shoulders slumped, and mumbled the words the judge demanded. His apology was stiff, reluctant, but it echoed in the courtroom nonetheless. I wronged you, Amina. I treated you unjustly. For Amina, it wasn't the warmth of his words that mattered. It was the sight of the man who once cast her aside, now forced to acknowledge her in front of the world. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the reality wash over her. She wasn't the broken woman in the rain anymore. She was someone who had fought back and won. When the gavel struck, signaling the end of the case. The room seemed to exhale. Amina stood tall, her bag on her shoulder, and walked out without looking back at Juma or his family. She didn't need to. Their bowed heads said everything. Justice had spoken, and she had reclaimed her dignity. Amina stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time in months, she felt its warmth reach her heart. People's eyes followed her as she walked, but this time it wasn't with pity or gossip. It was with respect. Her shoulders were no longer heavy with shame. Her steps were steady, filled with a dignity that could not be taken away. She was no longer the woman who had been thrown out in the middle of the night. She was someone new, someone whole. As she held her bag close, she thought of the long road she had walked, the rain-soaked night, the whispers of neighbors, the painful memories of sacrifice, and the fire that had carried her into the fight. Each moment had shaped her into the woman now walking out with victory. Yet she knew her story could not end here. Too many women like her were still out there, silent, abandoned, and alone. That evening, as she sat with Zuri, an idea took root. She would create a foundation, a safe place for women who had been cast aside, a voice for those who had been silenced. Her pain would not be wasted. It would become a bridge for others to cross from despair to hope. Amina looked up at the sky, her veil still folded in her bag, no longer a symbol of loss but of survival. Her lips curved into the smallest smile as she whispered the words that had been waiting inside her all along. They thought they ended me at 2 a.m., but that was the hour I began again.